So, thanks for that introduction, Tatiana, and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the works of Margerie Venables Taylor, Miss Taylor, as she was universally known. Although, interestingly, from the very beginning of her career, she published under the name of M.V. Taylor, assuming an academic identity which deliberately obscured her sex or rendered it irrelevant. A quarter of a century after her death, Shepard Frere paid tribute to Taylor as a key figure in the development of Roman Britain as a field of study. But while this was not intended to be controversial at the time, and certainly would not have been while she was alive, it is also true that subsequent historiographical accounts often omitted any reference to Taylor at all. It is, of course, this striking discrepancy which makes her story a good addition to our colloquium this afternoon. For 50 years or more, Taylor was active at the heart of the British archaeological establishment as it was then calibrated. In 1925, she became the first woman to be elected an ordinary, rather than honorary, Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and later served as their first female vice president. From the 1920s to the mid-1950s, she ran the Roman Society, and as editor of JRS for 40 years, set high standards in academic publishing. Through the journal, Taylor also wielded enormous influence for all this time, effectively controlling access to wider recognition of scholars in classics, Roman history, archaeology. In recognition of her services to scholarship in 1948, she was made CBE in the New Year's Honours List. So what I'm going to try and do in the time available is explore certain aspects of this interesting career and draw together some thoughts on Taylor's significance in the history of Romano-British archaeology. Thinking about Taylor's career at this distance, I found it necessary to remind myself just how groundbreaking she was. Part of the first generation of British women from middle-class backgrounds, more likely than not to have access to a decent quality school and college education. And it is worth remembering that when Taylor left Oxford in 1903, the moment when women students would become eligible for degrees from the university was still several years in the future. It was only really during Taylor's adult lifetime that, apart from exceptionally, women had any real visibility in public institutional contexts. Seen through a modern academic lens, it's not surprising, perhaps, that there has sometimes been a failure to appreciate fully the implications of being among the first to operate in contexts previously the preserve of men alone, and the negotiations and compromises this may have entailed. With some justice, Taylor's career has usually been defined in relation to the historian Frances Haverfield, her sponsor and employer for many years, and the worth of her own work has been minimised partly because she was, and still is, described as Haverfield's assistant or secretary. She also chose a modus operandi which now seems perversely self-effacing, leaving little trace except in the publications of others. As early as 1924, when he was garnering support for Taylor's election to the Antiquaries, R.G. Collingwood made the observation that, quote, "She has always merged her work in other people's, notably Haverfield's, and hasn't got credit for it." It is not hard to see that the practice of introducing Taylor as Haverfield's assistant and Haverfield's secretary, while factually accurate, could hinder a keener understanding of her contributions to scholarship, both before and after the death of Haverfield in 1919. In a major study of Haverfield and his legacy, for instance, Phil Freeman argued that Taylor's actions after his death may have been motivated by a calculated need to create a position for herself, rather than considering she might already have earned one. And he considered Frere's assessment of Taylor's achievements, which I'll come back to later, was unduly generous, commenting that Frere went as far as to group her contributions to Roman studies with that of Haverfield and Collingwood, although she was not to produce the sort of work that made Haverfield's name or to undertake major excavation. So, who was this person and where did she spring from? Well, Taylor was born in 1881, the daughter of a Chester solicitor who was also a keen local historian and fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. As this snippet from a birthday tribute to Taylor, published in GRS, suggests, her father's antiquarian work, together with a revival of interest in Chester's Roman past during her childhood, apparently had a very formative influence. And this is also where Haverfield enters the frame. Although still a schoolmaster at this point, rather than the university professional he was to become in the 1880s, he was already making his name as an expert in Roman epigraphy. And because of this, in 1889, he became involved in a scheme to excavate part of the medieval city walls at Chester, where a cluster of stones bearing Roman inscriptions had been discovered. According to Taylor, Haverfield was active in Chester antiquarian circles throughout the 1890s and made many personal friends there, including, we infer, her father, who was the secretary of the excavation committee, and his family. Inspired by the episode and by Haverfield's approach to researching the history of the Roman occupation in Britain, Taylor is said to have decided on archaeology as a career. From the Queen's School in Chester, in 1900, Taylor entered Somerville College, Oxford. She studied for a degree in modern history, but although she passed her final exams, she had to wait 17 years to be awarded a degree until the women's colleges became part of Oxford University in 1920. By the time Taylor was at Somerville, however, Haverfield was well established as a don at Christ Church. Although one imagines he had little to do with her while she was a student, the family connection may have helped her to secure her first employment as a researcher on the Victoria County histories, an ambitious multi-volume commercial publishing project with which Haverfield was closely involved. Although initially, at least, Taylor was based in London and employed by the histories rather than by Haverfield personally, periodically she also seems to have worked more directly for him. And after 1907, when he became Camden Professor of Ancient History, increasingly so. They co-wrote, for instance, the Roman chapters of the Shropshire volume of the histories, which became, in 1908, the first publication to her name. Within a couple of years of leaving Somerville anyway, she was back living in Oxford. She continued her research apprenticeship, including an edition for publication of a 12th century text by a monk at the Abbey in Chester. At the time she would have been working on the De Laude, Taylor featured on the 1911 Chester census return completed by her father Henry Taylor as History Research Student, brackets Oxford, 30 years old. As is also evident from this title page, the early years of her career, Taylor must have been one of the several hundred women who took advantage of a traditional reciprocal arrangement between Trinity College Dublin and the English universities of Oxford and Cambridge to give herself some academic credentials. I hope you can make out her MA Dublin on the slide. 1913 to 1914 saw her in Rome working for John Marshall, an art dealer and antiquities expert acting on behalf of the New York Metropolitan Museum, and an old friend of Haverfield's. Having returned to Oxford following the outbreak of war in Europe in 1914, however, Taylor then worked exclusively for Haverfield until his death in 1919, a period when his health was poor. She was his right-hand woman as well as a friend and support to his wife Winifred, her direct contemporary at Somerville. That Haverfield was as productive as his bibliography would suggest during these years of illness is a reflection of the working partnership which he and Miss Taylor had been developing over the previous decade and now came into its own. There is an interesting glimpse of the way it operated in an article of January 1917 from the Manchester Guardian. This consists of a précis of a paper prepared by Haverfield, but with Miss Taylor's assistance, it states at the top, which she then travelled to present on his behalf to its intended audience, a meeting of the Chester Archaeological Society, conveniently enough. It should also be noted that in various tributes to Haverfield after his death, his academic contemporaries gave Taylor due credit for their joint work. It is clear that she was considered to be the colleague without whom Haverfield could not have continued to work. Taylor was in her mid-30s by this stage, well practiced in the skills of research, writing, editing, and presenting, and clearly respected by colleagues in the field of Romano-British studies. Following the death of Haverfield in 1919, Taylor continued his work in a literal sense, completing the Roman period chapters for several more county histories and making further autonomous contributions for years to come. But for Taylor, there must also have been the question of how in practice she could ensure Haverfield's broader mission to promote the study of Roman Britain continued. To return to Shepherd Frere and the value he retrospectively placed on Taylor's contribution to Romano-British studies, in 1987, by then retired from his Oxford chair in the archaeology of the Roman Empire, Frere gave a lecture at All Souls entitled Roman Britain since Haverfield and Richmond. In this, he ascribed the continued existence of Roman Britain as a subject for study at the university, quote, to Francis Haverfield and his twin successors Robin Collingwood and Margerie Venables Taylor. According to Frere, Collingwood's material contribution as the dominant figure in the subject in the 20s and 30s was the report on archaeological work on Roman sites and new inscriptions published annually in the JRS by Taylor and Collingwood, and of course, his ongoing work on a new corpus of the Roman inscriptions of Britain, a Haverfield legacy project. Most of the credit, however, in Frere's estimation, should go to Taylor herself, quote, her devotion to Haverfield's memory and principles, her stern scholarship and intellectual prestige. In an autobiographical memoir, Collingwood took the opportunity to describe in some detail his understanding of what his obligations may have been following the death of Haverfield, and how this fed into his work in the interwar years. By contrast, Taylor left no account of her life and work. She took some care, in fact, to dispose of papers and correspondence from which her perspective could be reconstructed. Not only has this left more space for the great men of archaeology to fight it out posthumously, but also, as she may not have foreseen, for her contribution to be underappreciated and even misconstrued. It has been argued in good faith, for instance, that the chief motivation for the zeal and tenacity with which she prosecuted her late employer's wishes was self-interest, and that her influence resulted not only in a distorted version of Haverfield's significance, but in the stunted development of Romano-British studies for decades. Although the focus of this characterization of Taylor's career is not really Taylor herself, of course, but Haverfield and his legacy, to disentangle cause and effect, it should be possible to look more closely at what Taylor set out to do after 1919 and why. By the time Taylor published an obituary for Haverfield in the Journal of Chester Archaeological Society, he'd been gone for nearly a year, and the terms of his bequest to Oxford University were in the public domain. Taylor's article is therefore significant for our understanding of what informed her future work. She outlined the philosophy behind Haverfield's interest in Roman Britain, inspired directly, she explained, by Mommsen's appreciation of the importance of Roman provincial archaeology. This had shown Haverfield how to take finds such as the Chester inscriptions, quote, out of the sphere of local archaeology and fit them into their proper place in the history of the empire. The comparative contextual approach was the crucial element. After he was elected Camden Professor in 1907, Taylor wrote, he had begun to advance his ideas, quote, by training a school of Romano-British archaeologists and by promoting excavations in every part of Britain. And under the terms of his will, quote, he left to the University of Oxford a sum of money for the excavation of Romano-British sites under proper direction in the hope of bringing together ancient historians and local archaeologists. She concluded that although the two peoples Haverfield had identified as his immediate potential successors had been killed in the war, she hoped that the impact of the bequest would be to encourage younger scholars in the direction of Roman Britain. It is not too much to say that the principles and future hopes laid out here were the credo to which Miss Taylor harnessed her energy and considerable talents for the next 40 years, with the singular, quote, devotion to Haverfield's memory and principles alluded to by Frere. It might almost be described as a joint venture between one living partner and one dead. In practical terms, from 1921 she acted as secretary to the administrators of the bequest. Then in 1923 she became secretary of the Roman Society, established by Haverfield in 1910, and editor of the JRS. These posts were the pillars on which Taylor built her work, based in the library of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where Haverfield's books were housed. Her work for the bequest included much travel to cast a critical eye over the progress of the excavations they were funding. Back in Oxford, meanwhile, she prospected for archaeological talent among the undergraduates who visited the Haverfield Library. Christopher Hawkes came across her there in his first term at Oxford in 1924 and described how she'd helped him throughout his time at the university. First, she arranged for him to join Wheeler's excavation at Brecon Gower in 1925. Then the following year, using money from the bequest, she set him up on an excavation at Alchester, northeast of Oxford, complete with his own workmen. Similarly, Ian Richmond was sent to join Wheeler's excavation of the fort at Saguntium, which was part funded by the bequest, then encouraged by Collingwood and Taylor to apply for a studentship at the British School at Rome. The preface to the report on Roman Britain in Taylor's debut volume of JRS in 1923 articulates the relationship between the separate threads of Taylor and Collingwood's work for the bequest. The role of the Haverfield Library as a reference library and repository of information, their commitment to an annual report on excavations and new inscriptions, and perhaps above all, the Roman inscriptions of Britain, RIB. From her desk in the library, Miss Taylor had clearly embarked on coordinating an ambitious programme to make Roman Britain a larger and more serious area of Roman studies. These were also intensive years of collaboration during which she worked steadily to support Collingwood and to keep Wheeler on board, partly by sanctioning successive grants to fund his excavations. The level of her involvement in their project is indicated by the prominent acknowledgement of her in their publications and her presence in the organisation of their archaeological work at a local level. She was, for instance, a member of the excavation committee at Brecon Gower and on the committee of Collingwood's Hadrian's Wall pilgrimage in 1930. Their respect for her influence was the central plank on which their support of her election to the Society of Antiquaries in 1925 was built. Taylor's authority is also particularly evident in the central role she played in public and private discussions on the future of archaeology taking place during and immediately after the Second World War. These led to the Council for British Archaeology and other significant initiatives which featured the hidden hand of Taylor, and collaboration with archaeologists such as Richmond and Kathleen Kenyon. Although not a teacher herself, Taylor also proselytised vigorously for the potential of Romano-British archaeology as a route for keeping the teaching of classics alive in British schools. The traces left by this strand of her later work shed considerable light on her network beyond the Roman Society and Oxford, and are something which deserves to be more thoroughly explored. As already suggested, Taylor made no arrangements for the archiving of letters and personal papers, or even papers relating strictly to her work. In an obituary notice for JRS, Richmond implied that she deliberately destroyed much material in the months before her death. She may, of course, have felt the legacy of her work and her reputation to be secure to her own satisfaction, and it was clearly her call. But one must admit that in the absence of a more substantial record of excavation and publication, or pupils through whom Taylor's influence can be traced, decisions she apparently made at the end of her life have contributed to her work being underestimated and overlooked. If anyone here or watching later has come across letters from Miss Taylor to people other than Eric Burley, Ronald Syme, and O.G.S. Crawford, I'd love to hear. Because her letters are always dated and often full of people, places, ideas for articles to be written, and so on, even the shortest and most innocent postcard almost always adds a little piece of information or insight into her networks over time. To conclude my contribution to the afternoon's proceedings, however, let's draw together what may be said about Taylor's career so far. In his article marking the centenary of the Roman Society in 2010, Chris Stray judged the influence she wielded here to have been exceptional by any standards. To quote him directly, "Not only did she reign as secretary and editor of JRS for many decades, she also crossed the conventional boundary between the male academic and his female secretary to become a one-woman administrative and editorial powerhouse." I've also argued more broadly that Taylor found that a collaborative way of working suited her, and that a working partnership with Haverfield took root during his declining years and developed rapidly after his death. This facility for collaboration, apparent willingness to subsume her own academic identity to others, as noted by Collingwood, is certainly one of the factors which seems to have made it more difficult for her achievements to receive the acknowledgement they deserve. In his article, Stray noted varying assessments of Taylor's impact on Roman studies, Roman British studies. To Frere, she had her finger on its pulse, tirelessly verifying and recrafting excavation reports for the journal. In a letter of reminiscences deposited in the Roman Society archive, meanwhile, Mary Bennett, who was secretary between 1960 and 1985, noted Taylor's unwillingness to engage with the idea of a new journal dedicated to the subject. Quote, "During Miss Taylor's lifetime," she wrote, "the lid was firmly kept on Roman Britain." As is frequently the story of individual contributions to any discipline, both judgments bear witness to Taylor's loyalty to a set of principles which became outmoded. The vigilance with which she maintained Haverfield's vision of Roman Britain as a province of a great empire, and adherence to certain methodologies by which this should be explored, have inevitably diminished her significance as the subject evolved. Her long career was also very particular to its time and context, and there are some interesting challenges associated with understanding the power and influence she wielded in the British archaeological establishment in the 1950s and 60s. All these years later, almost everything about the world in which Taylor operated seems alien, narrower, smaller, more exclusive. Nevertheless, she forged a unique career as an administrator, editor, mover, and fixer, which badges such as secretary and assistant cannot begin to describe. Somewhat inevitably, she survived in the memory of several generations of Oxford undergraduates as formidable and a bit of a dragon. But I've also discovered she had and retained a tremendous zest for life. She really loved what she did. Looking back on her working life at the age of 80 for an article in the Times, she's reported to have said something which somewhat captures this, I think. "It has been a happy life, for I have enjoyed my work. When you get to my age and have lived through wars, you realize that though wars come and go, work and learning do and must go on." On which note, I think I'll stop there and hand you on to our next speaker,